Well, good afternoon all, and thank you for joining us today for the first of our Sector Spotlight series, where we delve a little deeper into parts of Mirvac's business. Today we're going to discuss our decarbonisation initiatives, and I'm delighted to have with me today Sarah Clark, who's our Group General Manager of Sustainability, along with David Palin, who's Director of ESG and responsibility for sustainability for us across our investment portfolio. And finally, Catherine Curry, who's Director of Sustainability across our development, design and construction divisions. We released our Net Positive by 2030 update report to the market this morning. It can be found on our website with an update on our Scope 3 emissions targets. And today's session will give you great insights into how we're leveraging our integrated model to achieve these goals. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A chat box and we'll endeavour to answer them at the end of the session. With that, I'll now pass across to Sarah. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Gavin, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne, or Naarm, and I acknowledge the elders of this country, past and present, as well as extend that respect to any First Nations people who are dialing into our session today. Welcome. As far as Mirvac is concerned, we are about to embark on our third reconciliation action plan, and you can see behind me on my team's background some evidence of that. We're at Henley Brook, a residential project in WA. Our team engaged and collaborated with local traditional owners and put together this park with artwork which features traditional knowledge as a way of handing down that knowledge and preserving it over the long term. We'll get started by just giving you a very brief overview of our ESG strategy. Many of you will be familiar with this because we first laid it down in 2014. So we have been at it for quite some time. This is our strategy on a page and we'd be happy to answer any questions about it. But I think a couple of things that I just want to point out is that it really is characterised by being very bold and ambitious. And you can see there that we are striving for very significant targets. But it's also characterised by a really good track record of delivery against those targets, which I think has been a standout and a feature of Mirvac's sustainability approach. Just on the next slide, please, Kat. Thank you. In particular, back in 2014, we laid down a really ambitious decarbonisation target, and we've been on a journey ever since. And so that target back then was to be net positive in Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 2030, which was seen as very bold and ambitious, and it was. And Mirvac didn't have a clear idea of how we would achieve that at that time. But by 2019, we had formed a clear view and we set out a plan around how we would meet that target by 2030. And we were really pleased to be able to accelerate on that plan and deliver it 9 years ahead of target. So it was at that time that we started to then tackle the more complex subject of Scope 3 emissions. And we set an extended target around emissions to be net positive in Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions by 2030. And we said at that time, that was a couple of years ago, that we would spend some time in the organisation really thinking deeply about what that means for us and come back and update you. So this session really today is to honour that promise and to be able to come back and to say we have really looked within our organisation, we've looked at the factors influencing our emissions outside our organisation, and the board has reaffirmed our commitment to that goal. And we want to take you through where we stand from today around how we think that we will reach that goal by 2030. So why is this even important to us? I'm sure that this won't be news to you, but we can see that customer expectations and the expectations of capital have been increasing sharply over time. For example, in Sydney, 74% of Sydney customers and 67% of Melbourne CBD customers, and those are big customers looking for 5,000 square metres or above, have net zero targets. And so work like this helps us to really meet our customers where they are and anticipate their needs and be ready with the kinds of assets that they're going to need in order to meet their own targets. And likewise with regulators as well, we can see, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please, Kat. Thanks. The Australian government has joined governments around the world, including the UK, the EU and the US, to put our new standards around mandatory climate disclosures. And so with those expectations increasing, we know that that's obviously going to drive disclosure and transparency, which is a good thing for us and for you. But we anticipate too that that's going to mean an uplift in performance as more is disclosed. And so we are noticing that shift happening with the rating tools that we look at, like NABERS and like the Green Building Council of Australia's Green Star ratings. And we can see that in order to maintain high performance with those ratings and secure the kinds of customers that we're looking to attract, we need to really keep pace with their expectations around decarbonisation. And this is a partial response to that that we're sharing with you today. And of course, ESG is a very strong driver for employee engagement at Mirvac, and we can see that that trend only continues to increase. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Kat. On the left, you can see a snapshot of how things have changed from 2022 when we last talked about this until now, and all of the things that we were noticing in terms of those expectations that I've just mentioned. We had anticipated that they would stay an increase in terms of our stakeholders' expectations. And I think what we've seen is not only have they advanced, but they have advanced and increased faster than we were even anticipating. So we do feel like having an ambitious target is in line with those expectations. And on the right, there's a set of charts there that are really important to be aware of in this context. The first one is, they're both from the Australian government. And the first one shows the Australian government's anticipated decarbonisation rate across the whole economy out to 2030, showing a 31% reduction. And the chart down the bottom is in particular the Australian electricity grid and the greening of the grid and how that grid is decarbonising out to 2030. And you can see there a very rapid decarbonisation. And the work that we're sharing with you today looks at those external factors, understands how important they are for us, leverages those factors, and then builds upon them with our own action to reach the target that we're pursuing. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is a quick snapshot of the way that we're thinking about Scope 3 emissions. It's very similar to what you would have seen a couple of years ago. We've taken a wide-angle lens on the things that we are responsible for. And of course, we've referenced the greenhouse gas protocol in doing that. And on the next slide, we can see that what we can see around our emissions profile, looking back at FY19, which is our base year, and then looking forward to FY30, which is our target year, that the emissions profile in Mirvac really changes. Whereas in FY19, a large proportion of our emissions were from Scope 1, and we'll see those decrease very rapidly for reasons that we'll share with you on this call. So that what we're looking at in terms of residual emissions by FY30 is predominantly from embodied carbon in the materials that we buy. So that is one of the major sources of our Scope 3 emissions, and the major materials that we're looking at the emissions are coming from concrete, from steel, and from aluminium. The two other sources of major Scope 3 emissions for Mirvac are the use of leased product and sold product in terms of the heating, cooling and lighting that those finished products come with. So on the next slide, we'll show you how our decarbonisation trajectory looks. And I'll just talk you through this slide to help you understand how to read it. You read it from left to right, and this is really our plan on a page as to how we will get to net positive by 2030. That asset structure on the left-hand side is a profile of the emissions that Mirvac has at FY19. And you can see that each floor within that stylised asset represents a different type of emissions. Right up the top, we've got a small portion of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And then all of the floors underneath that, which are colour-coded, they represent different types of Scope 3 emissions. So, for example, the yellow there is the use of sold product, the use of heating, cooling and lighting in sold product. And the grey there is the embodied carbon in the materials that we're buying. As we come across to the right, we can see a really steep downward trajectory on our decarbonisation. And that is as a result of the external factors, some of which we covered just a couple of minutes ago, things like the greening of the electricity grid in Australia. And you can see there that is a really significant contributor to what we are seeing in terms of our overall decarbonisation. And because we are so reliant, and others are too, on these external factors, those are things that we'll monitor very closely. The Australian government updates their forecasts on those numbers every year. Those will be things that we pay a lot of attention to. And as we need to, we will review if that pace changes for them significantly and that impacts our progress. We will be obviously coming back and sharing that information with you. But as we move further to the right in terms of the internal factors, these are the things that we will continue to do and step up doing, things like putting more solar on residential and on industrial, things like electrification of our assets and our operating portfolio, as well as reducing the kinds of materials or the embodied carbon composition of the materials that we buy. So what we can see by FY30 in the bottom right-hand corner with our cement truck there is our residual emissions, and we anticipate that those are predominantly going to be embodied carbon in materials, which will be harder to abate. And for those, we will be looking to purchase offsets, nature-based, high-quality Australian offsets, which takes us then to net positive. So these numbers are all based on estimates and forecasts, and they are, of course, very subject to change over the next 5 years. But what we do know is that as they stand at the moment, that cost around offsets for Mirvac is not material. If that changes, that would be something that we would reflect on and we would come back and talk about. But we have signed up, of course, to the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is something else that we committed to, and we are in the process of having this target verified by the SBTi. So I might pause there, that's a lot to take in, and then hand over to David Palin, who's our ESG leader in our operating portfolio, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how we're going to do that on that operational side of our business.
Thank you, Sarah. What we're going to do is we'll start looking at electrification and solar or renewables in a bit more detail. But we thought to start with, why don't we have a look at the different emission scopes, and so we can see what the different contribution is across those different elements. And also we can show the work that we've been doing over the last few years to reduce or abate, and ideally to eliminate those emissions across the board, across all those different scopes. It might be worthwhile, I know Sarah gave a great introduction there, but in terms of the scopes, what do we mean when we look at these scopes? When we look at them from an asset management perspective, scope 1 is kind of the fuels that we burn on site. So it could be diesel, it could be refrigerants that are emitted, predominantly gas. Scope 2 is delivered electricity to the sites, and scope 3 would be really around tenant use of our resources or our facilities, so the emissions associated with their energy use, and it could be in terms of the waste as well from the operation of the properties. So in terms of scope 1, 2 and 3, we always start with a foundation of energy or resource efficiency. And this is across all the scopes because we have a strong belief that the cheapest kilowatt hour is the one we won't use, the cheapest ton of carbon is the one we don't emit, and the cheapest ton of what we call waste or resources is the one we do not send to a landfill. So if you look at that and what we've achieved through that approach, and in the asset we're in today, which is 200 George Street here in Sydney, when we were developing 200 George, we took the approach that we were going to move from a 5 to a 5.5 star outcome in terms of neighbours, and we were going to do that by moving away from more exotic type technologies, sort of by what I mean there is things like a tri-generation or maybe black water systems, and we were really going to focus on energy efficiency. And that saw an uplift from 5 to 5.5 stars. It meant that in operation, our energy costs were reduced by circa $200,000 a year. And if we divide that by the cap rate of around about 5% at the time, that equates to a $4 million valuation uplift. And that's really focused on efficiency rather than doing something extra. It's doing something we're already doing. We're doing it really well. So that really is the foundation piece for what we start now and looking at each individual scopes. So in terms of scope 1, we're looking at removing gas. It's what we're calling electrification, and we're removing that base building gas infrastructure across the portfolio. We're also looking at the type of refrigerants that we use, because those refrigerants have what's called a global warming potential. So for example, a refrigerant like R134A, which is a fairly standard refrigerant we use in the portfolio in HVAC systems, for every kilogram that's released, it's equivalent to releasing 1,300 or 1,400 kilograms of CO2. So they have quite a significant, quite material impact. So again, we're looking at moving away from those high global warming potential refrigerants to lower global warming potential refrigerants, ideally one. And also moving over to natural refrigerants wherever we can. And then the residual, as Sarah mentioned, the residual piece there around Scope 1, we're purchasing high quality nature-based Australian carbon offsets. On the second piece you'll see here is Scope 2, this is delivered electricity. And what we did, once we'd been through that piece around looking at energy efficiency, which I should say is an ongoing piece, but in terms of over the first 5 years, there was a real focus on energy efficiency. We reduced the carbon intensity of the portfolio by 20%, purely by looking at energy efficiency and reducing unnecessary energy use. And that put us in a position then where we could competitively buy renewables, renewable electricity off the grid. So we've been purchasing 100% renewable electricity since 2021, and our first major purchases were actually back in 2020. On top of actually buying that resource from the grid, that renewable electricity, we've also been installing on-site renewable systems, and we have a number, about 4 megawatts plus now of on-site renewable systems. And again, the real focus, even with those two in place, is around energy efficiency. On Scope 3, it's really been around understanding what that Scope 3 looks like. So in terms of installing meters to collate the aggregated tenant use across the portfolio, on selling 100% renewable energy through our embedded network. So wherever we have an embedded network, we actually on-sell 100% renewable energy to our tenants, our residents, and our retailers. And we also install solar so that we can offset their load as well. We've been reducing waste to landfill. We have the operational zero waste to landfill strategy. And to get to that point, we've been implementing circular economy initiatives like the Circle coffee cups here at 200 George and other assets. But we've also been working with social enterprise partners to look at the waste that is going to landfill and what we can do to understand that waste better and to reduce it. So on the next slide, we'll focus in on electrification. I mentioned that around the Scope 1. So I think this probably even dates back to one of Sarah's slides around what we're seeing in the industry now. And it's been great that we've seen the drivers for electrification really come to the fore over the last 12 months. And there was a slide there where Sarah mentioned that circa 70% of major tenants across the major CBD spaces in Australia have net zero targets. And we're really seeing those commitments now transfer into space requirements. And we've seen the government a couple of years ago, they came out and said we want to be in 5.5-star assets, which have no gas from July this year. And we're seeing that certainly come through. We're seeing it in the major leases now that were coming from, say, banking tenants, professional services, technology, across the board. All the major leases that I've seen or been involved with over the last 12 months have had an electrification requirement in there. So it's great to see those things come through. We are seeing a number of other things come through in this space. There's some great leadership from Neighbours and Green Star, which are recognising decarbonisation of the grid, and they're building that into their tools. There's also opportunities for enhancing energy efficiency, might be through heat recovery or dedicated systems where we're using these heat pumps or electrification, that can give us a real uplift in terms of energy efficiency. It reduces our exposure to pricing volatility, and predominantly this is around gas, but certainly fossil fuels, but also in the carbon offset markets. And then finally on here is also an opportunity to de-risk assets and our exposure to some of those things, but also look at the supply and how do then look at over time in terms of how do we differentiate ourselves in the marketplace, but also how do we de-risk downtime for our assets. And it's dating back to that piece around there's lots of tenants coming through now and say they want all electric assets, but we don't have the supply in the market to really keep up with that demand. So it puts us in a really strong position around market differentiation. Just in terms of progress around electrification, we have 2 assets now that have been fully electrified, and we're working on several others. We've completed, or we're just about to complete, electrification studies across every asset with gas in the base building infrastructure. All our new developments, all electric, and this dates back to the actual completion or the development of ATN up in Brisbane. So we've actually had this requirement for all electric in our office minimum design standards since 2019. So we've been looking forwards in the market and saying, well, what do our new assets need to deliver? in terms of what the market are asking for, so those low GWP, global warming potential refrigerants, and all electric, but also in how we're going to achieve those net positive targets under This Changes Everything. And also you can see here as well in both the apartments, but also in a build to rent, you can see 8 of those have now coming through as all electric. And that's great. And again, because we have embedded networks in those apartments, in our build to rent space, we can on-sell 100% renewables to those assets. I'd just like to finish on one point on this particular slide, just in that bottom right, where we talk about on-selling 100% renewable electricity. And what does this mean to our tenants? Well, we've had a lot of great feedback in that tenants, or say a resident in a build to rent facility, came to us and said, I've never been able to buy 100% renewables before. Simply couldn't do it through either leasing requirements or where I've been. So it's great to be in an asset now. I don't have to think about it. I get 100% renewables out of the plug every time. We've also had retailers and some of our office tenants where we've had renewables on selling, saying it was difficult for them to actually put a power purchase agreement or renewable energy supply agreement in place. So it's so much easier to be part of an embedded network where we can use our scale in the market to on-sell 100% renewables. And there's also a carbon benefit associated with that in terms of this almost 50,000 tons of CO2 reduction associated with that on-selling. And on the next slide, we'll have a look at that electrification process in a little bit more detail, just so we can talk through some of the opportunities. There's a few challenges here, but there's also a lot of opportunities when we're actually electrifying assets and looking at this from a portfolio perspective. I should say as well, we're actually treating this as a portfolio program. We have a dedicated program manager who's actually looking after this program. So we're actually learning a lot of lessons from across lots of different assets, and we're actually applying these across the whole portfolio. So where we've started here is really looking at identifying priorities, and these are really around the strategic drivers. So this could be lease expiry, strategic lease expiry, and again, coming back to some of those tenant requirements and market differentiation. It could be end of life, boilers or other pieces of equipment, domestic hot water coming towards end of life. But it could also be where we're looking at capital refurbishments. And this might be where we're doing bathroom upgrades or end of trips. Can we come into some of those projects and actually do small scale electrification? So electrifying those projects, it might be through a domestic hot water or a dedicated heat pump for end of trip. But it means we have this incremental approach. We're improving efficiency and we're incrementally improving. We don't have to do it in one big piece. We can actually do it as we go along because we have this strategic program in place. It's also given us an opportunity to experiment, which has been really important for the work that we've been doing in this space. So we've been trialing lots of different things. We've been looking at how quickly the building can reach temperatures. But one of the really key trials that we've been doing is looking at the current heating hot water temperature. So this isn't the water that we're supplying to the bathrooms or onto the floors. This is really looking at the HVAC, the heating ventilation system, and saying, well, how hot does the water need to be so that we can provide conditions? And we found across pretty much every asset, we can reduce the level of hot water or the temperature of the hot water that we've been using, which means that we can use smaller heat pumps. We don't need to provide as big a heat pumps. If even just at one asset, 200 George again, where we are today, that's saving by finding a system where we don't need to say heat the water to 80 degrees, we can heat the water to 60, 65 degrees. That's resulted in a plant saving of around about $500,000. So actually looking at it site specific and looking at it building by building and what we can do in this trial, it's actually saving us quite substantial sums in terms of the implementation. Just quickly through the rest of it, we're then doing a preliminary study, the electrification study. We're looking at lots of things as part of that study, but we really want to understand site specifics. So that could be where we might be able to locate plant and equipment. So it could be around spatial efficiency. We're looking at the thermal load analysis. How much load do we really need? Not a like for like replacement, but how are the buildings really using the hot water or the heating? We're looking at electrical capacity, and we're really thinking forwards with this one in terms of, okay, we need electrical capacity for our heat pumps, but we also need to think about how we're going to help our tenants. So they might be going all electric on, say, a commercial kitchen or food and beverage, but also starting to think forward around EV requirements for the buildings as well. So starting to put that all together into one study, that then helps us to then build this system design at that point. And that then gives us a budget and a program moving forward. And then we can build that into, again, some of these strategic leasing expiry or end of life. We can really start to build all those pieces together. We then go on to a detailed design, and then we look at implementation. I would like to say one of the key learnings here, and one of the questions that we often get, but a key learning here has been just how different every asset has been and how specific they are in terms of where their plant rooms are, how much space we have, what their thermal load requirements might be. So it's often very difficult to answer a question around, well, what should we allow for electrification? What's the cost? What's the budget? But what we are finding for domestic hot water type systems, and again, this is isolated, not building them into other works that are going on, where you would just absorb them into your normal project costs. But domestic hot water could be anything from $100,000 to say $250,000. And then for heating hot water, which is the big boilers in the buildings, and again, very, very site specific. There can be lots of challenges here. But we've seen buildings which might be $2 or maybe $3 million, and we've seen buildings anywhere from $5 to $10 million. Now, that's a huge range of costs, and apologies that it is quite a wide range, but that really reflects that there's lots of site challenges, lots of nuances in terms of the buildings, how much modification is required. Have we been lucky that we can reduce the heating hot water requirements, but also escalation? When are we looking to do this, and having to allow escalation for the equipment as well? So lots of things to account for, and that's why it's such a broad range. But that's the kind of cost that we're seeing coming through. If we can move on to the next slide, then we'll have a look at renewables and where renewables are really playing a part. And it's been a foundation, it's been a really important part of achieving that net positive, both in terms of scope 1 and scope 2, but also in moving forward to scope 3 by 2030. We've already mentioned the on-selling renewables, which has been a great benefit for our tenants and our residents and our retailers, but also for us in terms of our scope 3 reduction. But not only are we looking to on-sell wherever we can, we're also installing actual solar systems for the benefit of our tenants or our retailers. So in the residential space, there's been some great work here, and all the new built form has at least 4 to 6 kilowatts of solar on site. So that's helping our residents, both from a cost reduction in terms of energy, and we've seen some quite significant energy costs, but also in terms of a carbon reduction. So there's a great piece here from both the cost and the carbon piece for our residential customers. And Sarah mentioned as well, in terms of the industrial space, we've had some great successes. We've installed well over 2 megawatts now in terms of the industrial space. And again, this is helping our tenants in terms of reducing their costs, so operating costs in terms of electricity purchases, but also in terms of their emissions, and through our scope 3. I'd love to just mention here that we've actually enhanced our solar offering on the industrial portfolio. 5 or plus years ago, we were putting at least 100 kilowatts of solar onto our roofs. We're now putting at least 200 kilowatts onto the roofs of our industrial developments. But one here I'd really like to pull out is this is building 1, Aspect Industrial Estate. This is in Kemps Creek over in Western Sydney. We've installed, working with our tenant on this particular asset, we've installed an 830 kilowatt system. If we take a really conservative rule of thumb that for every kilowatt that we install, there's 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity that's generated. It's 830,000 kilowatt hours. What that would equate to is if we were charging that electricity, or if that was offsetting electricity purchased at 25 cents a kilowatt hour, we'd be looking at circa $200,000 saving for that particular tenant. So a material saving in terms of their outgoings. But if we look at the New South Wales grid and said, well, that was just coming from electricity, instead of having the electricity coming off the grid, that's a saving of around about 550 tons of CO2. And if we were being a bit naughty and just buying offsets and not buying renewables under the GHG protocol, that's if we were using about $35 a ton for our offsets, that'd be saving circa $20,000 for our tenants. So great savings, both in terms of the carbon, but also reducing volatility and also saving in terms of energy costs. So I think that's the last of my slides. What I'll do now is I'll hand over to Catherine, who's our Sustainability Director for Development, Design and Construction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So our development decarbonisation strategy focuses on identifying the strategic levers available to reduce carbon emissions across all our asset classes, from land subdivision through to industrial and office, and implementing these initiatives as we deliver on our projects. So as you've heard from Sarah and Dave, we're forecasting significant reductions in our operational emissions, and by 2030, most of Mirvac's scope 3 emissions will stem from the materials we procure and the construction of our projects. Whilst we're seeing some great progress in our supply chain to deliver lower embodied carbon materials, achieving these absolute reductions up front in our embodied carbon is still one of our biggest challenges, and also the challenge for the broader industry. In order to identify the opportunities to decarbonise on a project, it's crucial we understand the major contributors and also the reduction levers we can pull. So as indicated on this slide, embodied carbon associated with the manufacturing of materials we procure makes up around 90% of total upfront embodied carbon on a typical project. Of this, as Sarah mentioned, concrete, steel and aluminium make up around 3/4 of total material emissions, and hence it's on these major materials that we're focusing our attention. In forecasting our reductions, we've focused on the key levers, and this also includes design and the construction phase of the materials. And so based on the information we know today, we've built out our plan, taking into account material availability, supply chain innovation, and of course our customer preferences. Design decisions in the early phase of a project can actually achieve up to 20% reduction compared to an asset class baseline if this is done early. And this includes things like design standardization and efficiency, optimizing our structure, and of course material specification. Some of the things we're looking at include lower impact materials for our buildings, and this could include swapping out steel for timber in a mid-rise structure or adopting a hybrid structure where appropriate. And whilst the reduction opportunities in the design phase are significant, procuring lower carbon alternatives for our key materials will continue to be a major driver to achieving our goals across our projects. As mentioned, good progress is already being made with our key suppliers, and we're focused on continuing to work with our supply chain to encourage innovation and delivery of lower carbon materials. To explain this further, I'll briefly just touch on a couple of examples that are coming out of our projects. At Aspect, which Dave was just talking to a minute ago, another warehouse that's recently been delivered is the Winnings Warehouse, and it achieved a 6-star Green Star certification, exceeding the 5-star target that was set for the project and that building. This was achieved in collaboration with Winnings and our third-party builder, and included installation of 650 kilowatts of solar, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and also a genuine commitment from the team to reduce waste and divert from landfill. Aspect as a project has committed to climate active carbon neutral certification for upfront embodied carbon for all warehouses, and the team is focused on swapping out materials for lower carbon options to reduce the absolute carbon emissions in the delivery of the project. At 55 Pitt Street in Sydney, we're targeting a 6-star Green Star certification under the Green Building Council's new Buildings tool. Maximising design for operational efficiency, as well as partnering with our suppliers to achieve embodied carbon reductions, has been a key focus for this project. In collaboration with our steel supplier InfraBuild, we're utilising their new Sense 600 steel, and this offers a 40% reduction in embodied carbon compared to other products on market for essentially a cost-neutral impact. This is achieved through the manufacturing process, which utilises recycled steel, but also through the product achieving a higher strength grade, thereby requiring less material to be used. We've also, of course, procured low carbon concrete on this project, and these initiatives are contributing to around about a 20 to 25 overall reduction in carbon for the project. So consistency in procurement across our asset classes is a key driver when it comes to decarbonisation, and we're really focused on national supply agreements, and one of those is our procurement of lower carbon concrete. As outlined here, our housing team is using 30% lower carbon concrete on projects across New South Wales and Victoria, and as mentioned, Pitt Street and Harbourside, as well as Harbourside, are also procuring lower carbon concrete. Partnering with our suppliers ensures we can be at the forefront of product innovation and take advantage of further reductions in carbon emissions as these come to market. So that's all for me. I hope you've enjoyed today's update, and I'll hand back to Gavin, who will open up for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to Sarah, Catherine and David for a really informative update. I hope all those audience who've taken part will be able to get a good perspective of some of the initiatives we have across our business to decarbonise our broader portfolio. So we're now going to move to a Q&A session, and there is a Q&A bar at the top right-hand side of the MS Teams call you can see there. We have had a couple of questions come in already, but please, if you have any others, please send them through. The first of which is just asking about the risks of timing to achieving our targets of decarbonising by 2030. One for you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Gav. Thank you for the opportunity to respond to this question. Actually, it's a great question, and I think we have mentioned already today that we are monitoring factors like the decarbonisation in the Australian economy, and in particular the decarbonisation of the Australian electricity grid. And that is a major factor for us, because we can look at the electrification of our assets, and David's just shown you some great examples there. We can build these 100% electric assets, and if the grid is decarbonised, then no matter what choice our customers might make in terms of their energy use, they will be much lower in terms of carbon emissions, those choices. So there's only so much we can control there. We can ask our customers to buy 100% renewable electricity, and we're doing that for the first time at 55 Pitt Street. And so far we've had only support from our customers with that new ask. But if the rate of decarbonisation on the Australian electricity grid does slow, that will impact our ability to meet the 2030 goal. And that would be something that we would be, as I said, looking at every year and updating if we need to. At the moment, the trajectories are looking very positive for us. But then there are other things that we haven't factored into that decarbonisation trajectory on which we could see great upside. So, you know, Catherine's mentioned different choices we're making because of our integrated model, and we've got our hands on the levers of design and development and construction. And so we are making different choices with the kinds of products that we make, but we're not relying on a massive transformation, for example, in the steel industry, to suddenly have a completely new kind of product at the same price. So we haven't factored any of that transformation into our forecast, which could result in some upside for us. We know, you know, at some point FSC timber was a kind of a far-reaching or a difficult to get product, whereas now it is the only kind of wood you can buy in only kind of timber that you can buy in Bunnings. And so I'm not saying that we will have the kind of rapid transformation in steel that we might have seen there, but there is room for that transformation to occur. And when it does, it'll be upside for us. So we will balance all of those needs. Of course, the commercial interests of the organisation and of our partners and investors are at the heart of all of our decisions. And if that changes materially, we will come back and let you know.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Sarah. The second question, I think similar to that comment you made on steel, asking if we could provide a bit more detail on how we're thinking about reducing carbon in steel. Maybe perhaps some comments from you, Catherine, and Sarah, please feel free to chime in at the end.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gav. As Sarah mentioned, steel is probably one of our biggest challenges we're facing to 2030. We haven't forecast any significant change in that in terms of our strategy moving forward and how we're going to achieve our reductions. But really working with our supply chain early on our projects and establishing those relationships so we can start to get the benefit of some of the R&D they're doing to bring these products to market. InfraBuild's a really great example of that, where we engaged early and we've started to use their product that was initially designed for reinforcing steel in a column. We're now using that in our concrete slab. So that's a really good example of how we've taken one product and worked with the supplier to use it in different scenarios and applications. We are out in the market doing some significant research and engagement with our supply chain to find all the other InfraBuilds that we need to work with to make this happen.
That's really good colour. Thank you for that. And one extra one that's coming online, just asking about, and we do have some great examples used from all of you throughout the presentation, but if we could elaborate a bit more on some of the benefits of decarbonisation initiatives for our customers. I know we've had a project in Build to Rent project that's completing soon. I'd like to give some case studies on there, but any other anecdotes you guys could share that we're seeing across the business?
Maybe if I could start on that one, that what we found on a lot of times in terms of on selling 100% renewables and what we're doing around this space, it's the benefit for our tenants is that they can get access to these kind of products where it's very difficult for them to otherwise. So our ability to on-sell through our embedded networks has really made that so much easier for them. And then so they don't have to go out and purchase their own product. They're not having to go out and buy additional offsets or certificates on top of that. They're actually getting that just as part of their typical supply. So I think it's made life a lot easier. I think it's all the way from, say, a resident in a build to rent who would find it difficult to get onto those products, get access to those products, all the way through to other commercial tenants who are still having problems with maybe their size and their scale. So again, by Mirvac procuring and using our size and our scale of economies, we can actually do that in a cost-effective way for our tenants.
I might just add before the built to rent example too, if you don't mind, that we've seen really interesting research from JLL, which we can share with anyone who's interested about what tenants are going to be requiring in 2030. We've seen that the significant portion in the Melbourne and Sydney CBDs are looking at net positive targets. But what we understand from JLL's analysis is that demand for all electric assets is going to significantly outstrip supply. So I think a very simple answer to your question, Gav, is have the products that they need at the times when they need it. And there aren't a lot of electric assets in Australia that are not Mirvacs right now, especially in office. And so we're getting ready for what the market needs.
I think maybe if I could add to that as well, please, Sarah. We've seen evidence previously as well when, say, for instance, when we completed 8 Chifley, one of the tenants there actually came back to us and said, we know we've had our highest graduate intake. So we've been able to attract talent in the market. And the overwhelming feedback that we've had is that one of the reasons they've come to us is that we're now in a green building. We have a green head office, and they were demonstrating our credentials in our essentially our leasing decisions. We've also had some of our partners have come to us and said that they've been interviewing their interns, and over 70% of their interns have said the ESG strategy of the company is important to them. It's making their decisions. So talent attraction and retention has been a big piece around what we can do for our tenants and how we can help them in terms of their ESG journey.
I know it's certainly a big feature and talk to our HR teams about the importance of retaining and attracting people to our business. It certainly goes a long way there as well. So that's a good point. Okay, well, listen, I think that's been quite possible. We don't have any more questions coming through, but really appreciate everybody's engagement on this topic. If we did have any other further follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. And again, the full report is available on the website. You can see the link to it there at the bottom of the presentation. But thank you again for your time. I look forward to catching up soon. Thank you.